It's time for Tycoons of Small Biz, spotlighting the true backbone of the American economy, the true tycoons of business in America, the owners, founders, and CEOs of small businesses. The show's hosts, Austin Peterson and Landon Mance, are registered representatives of Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation, a broker-dealer member SIPC, and registered investment advisor. The views expressed by your hosts, Austin and Landon, are not necessarily the views of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Let's lean in as Austin and Landon connect with this week's Tycoons.
Good afternoon, Tycoons, and welcome to today's episode of Tycoons of Small Biz. I'm here, as always, Austin Peterson, with my co-host Landon Mance, coming to us from Las Vegas, Nevada. And we've got Ryan Weissmueller back on the show today with FinTrepid Solutions, who is the only one actually in studio today. Landon and I have both had COVID in our families, and so we are avoiding the studio for now for the safety of Karen and everybody else in the building. But we are excited to have Ryan in studio and on the show today. And I'm going to have Landon explain a little bit about the show and our relationship with Ryan going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan, thank you for making yourself available. So we are having Ryan back on the show today. He was kind enough to give us some more of his time because recent legislation that has been released, specifically business owner relief programs. We're going to talk mostly about the PPP, but Ryan has really become an advocate of the show here, a really important and valuable resource to our listeners, to our clients, to Austin and myself. So we're really excited to have Ryan back on the show. So Ryan, thank you for coming back and joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here again. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure is all ours. So Ryan, a lot going on right now with PPP and the idle PPP round 2 versus round 1, a lot of different moving parts. So maybe we just start at the beginning. You know, what are the key pieces that we all need to be aware of as small business owners of the recent, government bills, legislation that's been passed for small businesses? Maybe that's a good place for us to start.
Sure. Well, and the first thing I would say in kicking it all off is there is a ton involved in the bill overall. So we'll try and touch on a lot of the high points that apply to most businesses, but there's some real targeted funding relief and other things. So by no means exhaustive, but really the big pieces out of it, one would be a reopening and expansion of the PPP program, which you touched on. So PPP 1 can be applied for again for businesses who didn't apply for it originally and could have or should have. And then the creation of a second round of PPP for businesses that have been harder hit and need that relief. There's some qualifications for it, which we can certainly talk through. But at a high level, creation of those two programs and opening up almost $300 billion of additional funds for small businesses. So that, without question, was a huge win that a lot of businesses have been waiting for a long time. Some of the other big changes, and one huge change was PPP forgiveness. So they actually released a streamlined app for anyone who got a loan of $150,000 or less. For a ton of small businesses out there, that was going to be a huge administrative burden to go through the process, to collect information, to submit that information, to go through a bank. So now there is just a simple one-page app that has to be submitted, and that was 87% of all loans that were approved were under $150,000. So that is a big, big win for Main Street. No changes, unfortunately, to larger loans. There was some hope for that, but that in of itself was a big change and affects the vast majority of loans. And then a number of tax changes. And the biggest one being that the PPP expenses, so anything that was used with the funds of a PPP loan, are now tax deductible. There was, for anyone who was paying attention for a while there, the IRS came out and ruled that if you got a PPP loan, we weren't going to tax you on the amount of that loan if it was forgiven, but you couldn't deduct the expenses. Well, now that bill made that law. So in effect, business owners aren't going to be penalized. And really where that was going to leave a lot of companies is you needed this money to bridge you and get by. Now all of a sudden you're going to have a tax bill next April that you're actually going to have to give some of that money that you spent back. So again, huge win for small business there. A number of other things. So there were some other tax credits that have been extended, tax credits that you had to pick and choose, some payroll tax credits of if you got a PPP loan, you couldn't get these other payroll tax credits. The key I'm going to say with all that is talk to your tax accountant before making decisions on any of those things. But there were a number of other tax changes. The deductibility should be pretty universal. And then just some other I guess ones to point out. So there's some additional programs through the SBA. So for companies who are applying for new financing, you can actually get up to 6 months of payments basically paid for by the government, up to $9,000. So that's a big win for companies that are maybe looking to get some new financing this year. I think you have to apply before the end of March, if I'm not mistaken. But as long as the funds are available, that's a nice option for some additional relief. And then there's some specific targeted programs for businesses in the entertainment space, certain venues, airlines. There was a bucket of money targeted at the travel industry. So those are, in general, those are the things that are going to apply to most businesses. But it was, I think I read this was the longest bill in text in the history of the U.S. government. So there's a lot more meat there, and I'm not going to tell you I've read through every. I read through a lot more than I wanted to of it, but I didn't read every word.
So I want to go back real quick to simple forgiveness, because I know they were supposed to have the one page, application out by tomorrow. Are you telling us that it's out and on the SBA website, or where would somebody go to for that, or you don't know the answer yet?
It's not out. At least it wasn't out as of me hopping in the car to head over here for the show. You are correct. There were time parameters in the bill on when various things had to come out. I have not yet seen that one-page app. It will be released by the SBA. The applications to apply for new money have been out for, I want to say, a week, 10 days maybe. But that app for simple forgiveness has not been released yet. It is mandated in the law that it is one page, so it should be very simple. I think we know in general what's going to be contained in it, but that app has not yet been released to my knowledge.
Okay. Yeah, that was my understanding too, but something you said made me think that you'd heard it was out. So
we know the details, we just haven't seen it on paper.
I mean, I probably should have been more surprised that the government was early on something. That was what I heard when you said it. So I thought I would ask the point of clarification.
Good clarification.
Yeah. Ryan, I wanted to just reiterate something just to make sure that we are all clear, because as you know, Ryan, Austin and I focus on serving private business owners. We have clients that got the first round of PPP for as small as 10 and 15,000, and we have clients that got loans well over $1 million. But you mentioned now that the PPP proceeds, as long as you let me say that differently. PPP proceeds, as long as they were used for legitimate, qualified business expenses, now those proceeds, the expenses that were incurred are deductible, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So just to give a quick example, and let's say you got a $100,000 PPP loan and you spend that $100,000 on payroll. Before this bill, you would have not paid tax on the $100,000 income, the loan, when it got forgiven, but you couldn't deduct the payroll. Now you can deduct the $100,000 of payroll, plus with the loan being forgiven, you're not paying tax on that either. So there is basically no tax impact whatsoever of the funds or what you use it for.
Yeah, which is huge. I've got one client that owns several fast food franchises, and he got a substantial loan. And really these last 9-10 months, it's been this juggling act, because he didn't know whether or not he was going to have to, or whether or not he was going to be able to deduct those expenses. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that were just floating up in the unknown, because he didn't know whether or not he's going to be able to deduct those expenses. So that's huge.
Yeah, that one was one of the big game changers. And like you said, even I was actually just speaking to a client of ours last week who didn't even know that was part of the bill. So I don't know that everyone realizes that's out there, but that's a very big win for small business for sure. because not everybody's going to be able to get additional money. Everybody that was involved in PPP can take advantage of that.
That's great news for the business community. Let's talk a little bit about the new PPP, version 2. You alluded to the fact that I do believe there are stricter qualifications, in order to receive the PPP and then ultimately receive forgiveness. So can we talk a little bit about, PPP round 2?
Sure. And I think an important point too, and there's multiple aspects of it that were in this new bill, and I've even heard sometimes people jumble them together. So let me just break it down to be extremely clear. So basically, PPP 1, that original program, is essentially just reopened. There's money available for someone who wants to apply, needs to, and maybe just didn't in that original the original go round. The second piece, and you don't hear this one talked about much either, but we actually have a client that's in this situation, is they applied for a loan the first go round, but actually didn't get the full amount they were eligible for. You can actually reapply. So even if you're not eligible for additional financing, you can reapply to get the max amount you should have gotten. And then the third leg of the stool, if you will, is this true PPP 2, which is a fully new program for the hardest hit businesses. And so really what the government's done is these industries that and companies that have been particularly hard hit. And the other thing that I think is of noting in this is the maximum loan amounts in PPP 2 are $2 million. So there was a lot of bad press around some of these public companies and other companies getting $10 million out of PPP while, small businesses were striking out. They've really targeted this at Main Street. So specifically, it's a $2 million cap. Companies have to have 300 employees or less. And a lot of the other particulars around it function largely the same, but you have to have a 25% basically year-over-year decline in revenue. And that's measured, you can either measure that for the full year or just measure that in a quarter. So for a lot of businesses, they're going to take Q2 2020 against Q2 2019. Odds are for most companies, that's going to be their biggest hit. As long as they had revenue decline by 25% or more and meet those other criteria, they're eligible for those funds. And just like the first round, it's basically 2.5 times or 10 weeks of payroll is how the calculation is done. So you can look at, and another key point here, either full 2020 calendar year average payroll or full 2019. So maybe for a business that hasn't hired all their people back in 2020, where 2020 is still going to be a little bit skewed, you can go back to fiscal 2019 and pull an average monthly payroll that way, multiply that by 2.5, and that's your loan amount.
So that's an interesting point. You said, people who haven't brought, a certain number of employees back, they had 25 employees in Q2 2019. In Q2 2020, they had that many as well, but now they've got 6, right? So the early version of the PPP, the intent was to keep them on payroll.
Correct.
Right? But 10 weeks of payroll for a lot of companies was not enough for them to actually keep people on payroll. So they had to go from 25 to 6. And yeah, they're still open and they're still kind of surviving. But even now, it's getting tough to keep those 6 on payroll. So talk to us a little bit about the guidelines, because originally you had to keep them on payroll for that forgiveness. So where are we now in terms of forgiveness and keeping people on payroll and all those sorts of things?
Yeah, so the forms themselves are much more simplified. And really I think this one has been, this is me reading into it a little bit, but I'll give you my take on it. So the original loan, Austin, you were 100% right. They were putting that out there to basically keep folks on payroll, and that's why they distributed the money they did. In this second round, it's been far more focused and I'd almost say it's kind of making up for lost damage, because this bill's been talked about, going back for months. This is not new. It just finally got passed, at the end of December. So really what they're trying to do is for those industries that got really, really hard hit, provide them some additional relief. You don't have a lot of those restrictions. There's still the certifications that you have to make, but in terms of proving a lot of that out, those requirements aren't there the same way they were on PPP 1, where again, your forgiveness got reduced if you reduce payroll by too many, headcount by too much, or a lot of that has been simplified and taken out of this second round. So the application is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. And the other nice thing these days is payroll companies have gotten wise to it all, and they've actually got payroll reports that make this super easy for most business owners too, where they don't even have to do a lot of the math. So it's the process overall is much, much more streamlined than it was, way back in the throes of all this.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's great to hear. I mean, you think about all the businesses that had every intention of keeping everybody employed, but when the money ran out and the business hadn't recovered, well, what are you going to do? I mean, you've essentially got to cut anywhere that you can, and you try to keep the doors open. And I think philosophically we could go back and forth on whether or not there should have been something done for employees and employers, because there's also the flip side of that coin. I'm sure you've heard where a lot of employers are trying to get people back and they don't want to come back because now they're making additional money on unemployment with the additional money that they've given through the unemployment benefits.
Yeah. I don't care what side of the political aisle anybody falls on. This was a tough situation, no matter how you slice it and dice it. There was no one size fits all answer. I mean, I think, there's been a lot of positives for small business. I would have done some things a little differently, but, I'm seeing a lot more optimism now, certainly than I was, even 60 days ago, which is good. One other thing too, just to go back to it, because I know Landon, you mentioned your restaurant client. One other key piece too with PPP round 2 is for certain, and it's actually by NAICS code, but restaurants qualify, is the criteria is actually 500 employees or under, and you can actually get 3.5 times an average payroll. So for those really, really hard hit industries like those in restaurant entertainment, they can actually even qualify for more funds. But for the vast majority of businesses, it's going to be that 2.5 times.
Yeah. And just off the top of your head, do you know what industries fall into that category?
It's, so here's what's very interesting. And I looked at this. It's not as logical as you would think. And these NAICS codes are kind of arcane as to what falls into it. And it also depends on what's filed on the industry. This is a tricky point. What service you provide that's listed on your tax return, that defines what code you operate under. So I actually found out that a client was not operating under the code they thought they were as far as the IRS is concerned. Thankfully, it didn't matter for them regardless related to this. But that's something I'd look into that's unique to each business. But check your tax return because that's what's going to dictate that.
Yeah. Okay.
But overall, it's essentially travel, hospitality, restaurants.
The hardest hit, correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then, like I said, there were some channeled, I think there was 15 billion for like entertainment venues and other hard hit in addition to PPP, but they've clearly tried to get very targeted, very focused with the businesses that need it the most. And they started out too, the way this has gone. So originally it was only available to lenders that were really serving kind of the underserved areas of the community. So some of the smaller businesses, some of the underserved, minority communities that weren't getting the attention the last time around. So I think the government was very intentional that they started with the least served, then worked up to the smaller banks who, again, were serving more the community type businesses. And it just today opened up to everyone. So they've been very, very methodical in the way this is rolled out, which, again, it's where the need is.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So is there anything that as business owners that we all need to be aware of, Ryan, when it comes to forgiveness and the application for forgiveness for round 1, in regards to applying for round 2? I don't know. Are there anything we need to be aware of? Any pitfalls? Just any information there that would be pertinent?
Yeah. So there's a few criteria related to it. Now, to qualify for PPP2, you have to have gotten PPP1, and you had to have used the funds. You do not, and this is important, do not have had to have already had those funds forgiven. So if you spent all that money and let's say used it up in October and you haven't applied for forgiveness yet, you can still apply for PPP2. There's no restrictions there. So to some extent, forgiveness, those two things are a little bit mutually exclusive. And actually, a number of banks even aren't taking forgiveness applications right now. They've kind of put that to the side so they can process new loans. But for a business that wanted to and could, you could apply for PPP2 tomorrow and forgiveness on Friday.
Yeah, I want to just mention something that just came to mind as you were talking. Obviously, Austin and I and you, we have no affiliation or allegiance to any type of bank. However, there are banks that are a little bit more business owner friendly. So, not to knock any of the big banks, because they do some good stuff for business owners. But my comment here is kind of, are there certain types of banks that maybe people should look at to consider? Because I know I've had several clients that have come to me and said, I do my banking at ABC conglomerate and I can't even get in touch with anybody. So I'm going to go down to, XYZ local bank, and they were able to get in right away. So I don't know, maybe you have any thoughts or considerations there.
Yeah, and I'll give a little bit of a generalization, but I think it'll answer your question. I think so. So one thing that I have noticed that's changed this time around is in the first round of PPP, a lot of banks were taking loans for businesses that weren't clients prior to that. Fewer banks are doing it this round. And we've been in contact with a lot of banks on a routine basis. And I can just some of the ones we know, I can tell you we're in that boat where they're not taking it for non-customers right now, whether that's because of the demand or just the time intensive nature of it. But I think to your point, there are a number of people that had a difficult experience this first go round getting the loan. Maybe their bank wasn't providing the level of service they need. And I saw that, from a variety of banks. I think I would categorize it this way. So it's the path of least resistance. It's going to be faster if it's a bank that already knows you. So, there's a lot of companies out there that have multiple banks. And if you had a bad experience with one, but yet you have a relationship with another, that's probably helpful. If you don't and you're looking at something brand new, I think you do need to find out who's accepting them. The community banks in general have done I would say they've done a more on a broad scale, a better job of managing through it. And I think part of it probably because they're more used to dealing with some of those more unique, smaller transactions. But I would leverage, first and foremost, I'd leverage the relationship. And we actually have a customer that's in that boat. They had two banks they worked with. They first time didn't go well, so they went to the other bank, and they've been great in providing information. They've been very helpful. Because the other thing that's different this time around, and I can tell you this about one of the decent sized banks that had some challenges in round one, they put together a very slick portal for round two that I think is going to be much, much more user friendly, better for the customer. So it's something you've really got to weigh. I mean, the one thing I would say is there were folks there in the early going that ran into trouble that were applying at 4 banks. Be careful. I'm not going to tell you that don't do that under any circumstance, but that actually, people were getting applications kicked and then going back in the queue, and this money's not going to last forever either. So just make the best decision you can. Make sure you have somebody that you can talk to. The relationship is the most important thing. Forget ultimately who's handing over the money to you. You want to have somebody in there who's advocating for you, who understands your business. And if it takes less time to get somebody up to speed, the better off you are, even though it is a simplified process.
Yeah, so let me weigh in, put my 2 cents in there actually. So I've had a few clients actually that received PPP funds in round one that ultimately had a terrible experience with their current bank at the time, right? And they've switched banks since because of it. Some of them, it was the bank that they ended up getting PPP financing through, and they just switched to that bank because they got it done for us, and I'm going to show my allegiance. Some of it was just, you couldn't come through for me when I needed you. And so why should I stick with you? And so they switched to a more community business owner oriented bank, right? And essentially I'd given them a couple of different options to interview, and they chose one or two of the options I gave them. But the last thing that and it was essentially the larger banks that weren't ready. You're right. This time, I'm sure they're ready. They've figured it out. They don't want to miss out on the opportunity the second time around. And relationships are important. The one other thing that I would add, because I had several clients that I had referred to this entity that had very, very good outcomes, and that's lendio.com. So lendio.com. They're a loan aggregator. Mm-hmm. And so they work with a lot of different lenders, internet-based banks and lenders that are out there. And I had several clients that had phenomenal outcomes with them, getting it approved quickly, getting it funded quickly. The process was easy. The online application was easy. So, if you don't feel like you have a tight relationship with a bank, then I would look at a place like Lendio.com, because they can help you get it done quickly and easily.
And there certainly have been a lot of those loan aggregators that have popped up. You're exactly right, that have done a good job with it.
Yeah. And I do know that Lendio.com actually funded more PPP loans than anybody in the nation. So, they're working with traditional banks too, but
Sure.
they, basically it's that aggregator that made it possible to say, yep, we'll take that loan. That fits our criteria. We'll take it and we'll fund it. We'll make it easy and electronic signature this. And, so just something to be aware of for sure.
Yeah, I actually got my PPP through Lendio after I was rejected by my bank, Chase Bank. So I was a perfect example of taking advantage of a company that stepped up. So Ryan, there is just an overwhelming amount of information around these programs, and not everybody is as fortunate as we are, as our clients are, as your clients are, to have somebody like you that has spent numerous hours and a lot of time and money and resources staying up to date on all these changes. So for the business owners that are listening that don't have somebody like a Ryan Weissmueller, on their team, what do they do? Where do they go? How do they stay informed with all these changes that are coming out, what feels like by the hour?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would point everyone to, and I think there's the interesting thing that we've run into a lot with all these different government regulation changes and bills and so forth, even going back to when this all started in March, is there was a ton of information out there. Some of it was conjecture, some of it was slightly off contextually, some of it was just plain wrong. But it has made more than one CEO's head spin through all this, and understandably so. One place I will tell you that has been a very good source of information is the SBA itself. The SBA.gov, their website, they actually update and keep FAQs that they provide on a fairly routine basis. Now, interestingly, they have not updated those since December 9th. I checked that as of this morning. So my guess is there's going to be another wave of those that comes out. But basically, every time there's been material changes to the program, you can go and just read those last, I think they're on number 53 or 54, if I recall. You can just read the ones after that and kind of understand specific changes. And again, that's the SBA putting it out. They're the ones ultimately administrating the program. So that's straight from the horse's mouth. So that would be one that I would encourage people to go to. It's easy to find, easy to get. And they've actually done a good job, the SBA has, of that. The applications are all up there. Eventually, Austin, as you were talking about, that new forgiveness form for the 150K loans and under will be on the SBA website. So that's always a place just to go check, look for updates, et cetera. Now, you can Google search it and find lots of information, but I'll just give you a great example. This is why you got to be careful. I read something that was from a fairly reputable source that said you can look at quarter over quarter revenue, and you get to pick the quarters. So somebody could say April through July of 2020 versus April of July of 2019. Well, the bill, and again, I read it, says very clearly calendar quarter, January to March, April to June, et cetera. So that's a group that's putting out information that's just misleading. So that's where you've got to be extremely careful and make sure, some of those details are really important. The next place I'd go is the one we just talked about, your lender relationship. So whether that is a Lendio or, a bank like many people, hopefully their banker, and maybe they're not the direct point of contact, but can at least point them to the bank resources. Now, a number of banks, my inbox has been blown up, have done a good job sending out, information updates. Here's what's happening with our portal, et cetera. But for a lot of businesses, there are nuances to it. There's little tweaks involved. I'll give you another example. We've got a client, like I told you, that was in that reapplication process where they didn't get enough funds in their first round of PPP. There's not an application out there for that yet. The SBA has iterated and reiterated that exists. We don't know where to go. So literally had a conversation with their lender, and basically they kind of walked us through, this is what you're going to do initially. And if something changes, it changes, and we'll go. So that relationship, to be able to get answers to some of those questions that aren't as obvious, I would definitely maximize that, because the lenders are still on the front line of this thing. And one thing that I think is important for all the business owners to remember out there, the lenders are here to help. So this money going to their clients It benefits them. It benefits their clients because obviously they want healthier clients. But at the end of the day, they also want their clients to get these loans forgiven. So everybody is kind of aligned in an interesting way to get all this done. So the lenders are very much inclined to give you good information. And then the last piece that I would check in my experience, has been a very good source, is your CPA. It may be a small firm, but they probably have resources to some larger libraries. Certainly, a lot of the larger firms and regional firms have been putting out a ton of good information. Those three areas, you should be able to get just about everything you need to know. Just be cautious. Well, my neighbor did this, or I read this on, I saw this on a Google search, because I've just seen it enough where that information may not apply directly, or it may not even be right. And again, the last thing you want to do is make a simple mistake and get a loan kicked back, which again, you may submit it, find out you get it kicked back a week later, and then have to rush and scramble. And I don't think the money's gonna be gone in a week, but it's not gonna be around forever.
Yeah, very, very good advice. I mean, like you even said, I mean, even the source that you got it from is a reputable source, but they had misread
Mhm.
or potentially just mistyped what they meant in their explanation of the program. So it is important, if possible, to go directly to the source and work with good advisors.
And I think that that applies too, even beyond just applying for the new money, but forgiveness as well. Because we talked about this simplified form coming out with the 150K, and I think that should be very, very straightforward. What there was no change to was any of the larger loans. We know that loans 2 million and up are automatically getting essentially audited by the SBA, but for those
Yeah.
larger loans, there's still some questions out there of, one of the on the SBA site, it tells you that they're evaluating need both before and after the loan. Somewhat vague, but what exactly does that mean? Again, your lender's going to know because they're the ones that are going to be collecting that information. So work with them. How do you make their life as easy as possible by getting them what they need? They're incented to help you get that forgiveness, because they don't want these loans sitting on their books forever. But reach out to them on the forgiveness side too, and that's whoever gave you the original loan. So if you're switching lenders, you still have to apply for forgiveness by whoever's on the paper that gave you that first PPP loan.
So I've got an interesting question that fits with one of my clients that I think is probably a fairly common situation in the small business owner community. So what if in round one, you took a PPP loan for one of your entities, but another entity was doing just fine, and so you didn't apply for PPP at that point? Can you still apply for PPP 1 for the other entity, and then PPP 2 for the first entity that you took PPP 1 for?
So there are rules around the affiliations, and it relates to employee counts and control and those kinds of things. But so I'll give you a fairly generic answer, but in most cases the answer is yes. And so is the caveat to it again with that. So if an entity got PPP 1 and they meet the criteria for PPP 2, they can apply. Now, to your other question, maybe they didn't take the money because they weren't sure they needed it, and then realized 60 days in they really did. They can go back and apply for PPP 1, but again, they're going to have to testify to the need. So they're going to have to provide demonstration that the funds were needed, because that's really what the government is trying to make sure of this time around, is they're not just giving the money to people who apply for it, but to people whose business has actually suffered some kind of adverse effect.
Yeah.
But in general, I mean, I would certainly, without knowing all the details, my inclination would be strongly to certainly apply for it.
Are there broad themes that you're seeing in the market now about this legislation, finally being passed? I mean, are you seeing, let me rephrase that. So obviously there are themes that have emerged in the last couple of weeks specifically, but I do want to hone in specifically on a comment you made maybe 20 or 30 minutes ago about you interacting with your clients and everybody kind of having a more positive outlook of what the future looks like. So let's talk about the themes that you're seeing in the market now, specifically to this small business relief, and then just overall what you're hearing from your business owner clients about 2021 and beyond.
Sure. I think the biggest thing, and I think I mentioned this earlier in this conversation, but I know I say it all the time. The entrepreneurial spirit is still as strong as it's ever been. So, even during the throes of this and some of what you read, I don't ever think Main Street was as in bad a shape as some people would lead you to believe. Now saying that, I know people who have lost a ton, through this process. It has not been an easy ride. But that's different between laying down and giving up the fight, because what I've seen is Main Street has fought back and Main Street's winning. So I think there is a good sense of optimism. I think for a lot of businesses, this was a shot in the arm. So maybe if you look at it, PPP one for a lot of companies kept the doors open. This is really what's going to allow these businesses with PPP two to really continue to stabilize and hopefully to get to a point where they're thriving very, very soon. So I think that's one piece. I think the other thing you're seeing too, though, and it goes in line with that optimism, is I think there's still some pent up demand. There's obviously a sense of relief of this legislation finally being behind us. And again, regardless which side the political aisle you fall on, just the fact that all this election stuff is behind us. I realize there's still some discord in Washington, but at least we've taken some steps forward. There's a vaccine now. I think in general, I'm having more and more conversations with CEOs who can actually, at least in their mind's eye, see an end to some of this. So they're willing to start thinking about some decisions, thinking about propelling some things forward. So I think in general that optimism, and the other thing that's definitely out there is companies are making it happen. And so the thing I tell a lot of, I have the conversation with our clients and others is, if you're not doing it, your competitor might be. So what do you need to be doing right now to move the ball forward? And there's nothing wrong with an intentional pause. You need to stop at base camp every now and then, but you better decide if you're hiking up the mountain or down the mountain, but don't stand still, because you'll get past if you do. And I think that's definitely happening out there too, is there are companies very, very hard hit by this that are moving forward, trudging again, have figured out how to navigate in this new environment. And let's be real, it's created a lot of opportunities. I mean, look at e-commerce, look at, there's going to be some industries that have been disrupted, and it'll be very interesting to see where they go. But there have been some real opportunities elsewhere that I think there's a lot of opportunity to be taken advantage of. And we're seeing companies do that on a regular routine basis. And I have been really impressed by the level of innovation that has occurred.
Yeah. I would even go as far as to say that companies that weren't affected at all, like not even one iota from a revenue standpoint, have taken a look in the mirror and realized, gosh, I was on cruise control, and it's time for me to do things a little bit differently so that I can take my business from here to here over the next decade. Mm-hmm. And if I make some small tweaks now, because this made me think about it, I'm going to be, better off because of it. And so will the economy, and so will my employees. And so will, it's a, what's the word I'm looking for? Domino effect, right? So
I completely agree with that. And really, like you said, even a business that wasn't directly affected, seeing something like COVID come out of nowhere, rip the Band-Aid off for a lot of businesses, and maybe something you're willing to ignore 6 months ago because things were fine and, we could get by without it. Maybe that tire was just a little bit flat. They're looking at all four wheels now. And I think that, again, is just that intentionality, that focus in some areas, a little bit maybe more of a focus on execution. And again, flexing that entrepreneurial muscle, that's all good. I mean, that's going to help us going forward.
Yeah. Understanding that there's a different way to do things. I mean, there's just a lot of good that eventually will come out of this, or already has come out of it. I'll just give an example of our business. I mean, Landon and I's business, when the market tanked in the middle of March, a lot of people in our business would feel like going into this cocoon and avoiding the phone, right? And if you don't do that, and you get proactive and you reach out to your clients and you talk to them and you say, by the way, I do these Zoom meetings now. I know we were scheduled to do this. It's not a good idea for us to meet in person right now, but I'd still like to have our review call and go through certain things. It's given me an opportunity. I've been doing this for 20 years. It's given me an opportunity to look at my business in a completely different way and realize, you know what, going forward, I can actually be more efficient than I was before. I can serve my clients better than I was serving them before. And guess what? Revenue is going to increase because of it. Mm-hmm. And my business will be on a different trajectory because of it. I wasn't affected nearly as much as a lot of people could have been. Matter of fact, this is going to sound braggadocious, not meant that way. The revenue for my practice increased by 30% in 2020. And I attribute it 100% to being proactive and changing the way that I did things between March 15th and probably call it May 15th. I made a couple of small tweaks and small decisions to be proactive, and I paid I receive the dividends of that throughout the rest of the year. And there are a lot of other business owners that have done or can do the exact same thing.
And I think the piece you touched on too, and this is where I'm seeing businesses really win, the concept of value. You can't just sell your product anymore. It's what value are you bringing? Because I don't care what kind of if you're a virtual environment or an in-person analog environment, value doesn't change. You recognize value. The way you deliver it might be slightly different, but value is value. And the ones we're winning, just like you talked about, they're maybe having the tough conversations. They're maybe doing things for clients that other businesses won't. Maybe their competitors won't. But driving that value is winning. And so I guess that'd be one thing I would say too for the business owner out there is think of different ways that you can deliver value because there's still a premium on it and that's not going anywhere, regardless of what happens with the economy, the pandemic, et cetera.
Yep, absolutely.
I want to jump in real quick because you guys were talking about something that I think is really important. So I want to make a comment and I'll follow up with a question, Ryan. As we come out of the pandemic and the true entrepreneurs and innovators and disruptors, they're looking for opportunities to provide value to grow their firms. One of the things that Ryan and his team does is that they assess that growth that you want to take advantage of in your business, but then you guys help them to construct a plan around that. Because if a business owner says, oh yeah, I want to grow my profitability X percentage, I want to grow my revenue 2, 3, 4, 5X, I want to hire these people, I want to expand, I want to do this, I want to do that. And you sit down and you say, okay, well, how exactly are you going to do that? How are you going to, where's the capital going to be allocated? What are you going to do here? What are you going to do there? And one of the things that Ryan and his team does is they build that plan for you so that you can innovate, you can grow, you can provide additional value. So that is an unsolicited and an unplanned plug for you and your team, Ryan. But again, people that don't have a Ryan Weissmueller on their bench, and they do want to grow, they do want to provide additional value, they do want to expand as we come out of the pandemic. Ryan, what are some suggestions, some comments, some resources that these business owners can look to, assuming that they're not already working with you and your team?
Sure. I think there's a few things, and I'll start with one that's very easy that any business owner can do, and that's ask lots of questions. And you were just talking about growth, and the first two questions I would ask almost immediately is, okay, here's my growth target. Why? Because it's important to understand why that is the target, and is it the right target? And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And then the second piece is, okay, how do you get there? I think those are the places to start because it is, as you said, it's a path. And it's never a straight linear path. It's a very windy road. And the key is knowing it's a windy road, you just want to make sure you have the guardrails up to keep you from falling off the cliff because you're going to run into the sides. But asking lots of questions, challenging yourself, talking to your team. Are you equipped to get you to that level? Understanding, do you have the systems? Do you have the people? Do you have the capital, to get there? Or maybe it's a case we literally we've been having this conversation with a client for the last month or so, and he's actually pulled his growth goals back because what it was going to take him to get to, he wanted to get to level 2. We were talking about level 1. What it was going to take him, what he was going to have to give up, what he was going to have to sacrifice to get to level 2 wasn't worth it for him. And that was part of a discussion of really going through, dissecting that, understanding that. And your team is often great at helping you realize, yeah, Mr. or Mrs. Business Owner, we can't get there. We don't have enough. I can't get these sales for you that quickly. The wheels are already falling off the bus with what we're doing. So I think really looking inside internally in the organization is first and foremost. And then the other thing, a great tool that we use around it, and you can do it very rudimentarily, is just have a plan, have a financial plan, put a roadmap down on paper. So if we're trying to grow our sales from 5 million to 15 million, and that means our profit goes from here to here, okay, how much headcount do we think that means we need to go, to grow by? Can our system even process that much volume? When you start really putting some of those simple things down on paper and then realizing, because it's not as though you can just say, yeah, we're going to tack on another 5 million of sales on what we have today. Very few businesses can do that. So when you put some of those things down on paper, it gets very, very real. And then that also gives you a very stark look to be able to say, yeah, you know what, we can't get there. Or maybe, and we've run into this too, we had a real life situation where a business owner, he wanted to grow his sales by 30%. Well, when you looked at what it was going to take, because for them to sell in some different channels and do some other things, add infrastructure, et cetera, they were making more money, but they were giving up a lot of margin to get that growth. It wasn't necessarily worth it. So the focus was, let's grow with the right business. Let's grow our bottom line, not our top line, and that be the focus. So again, it's why that target is important. And I think challenging things first, challenging them throughout the process, and just putting some stuff to paper is hugely, hugely powerful. So you question the heck out of it, you memorialize it, you question the heck out of it some more, wash, rinse, repeat. That's probably the single best thing that any business out there can do.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think asking all those questions eventually gets you to the right question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which will then ultimately get you to the right answer. Because I'm reminded of Mike Michalowicz that was on the program about 6 months ago that came, and talked about his book, Profit First, right? And it reminds me of a transaction that I was involved in maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And the seller of this business kept focusing on the revenue numbers. The revenue's this, the revenue's this, the revenue's this. And they were focusing specifically on December holiday revenues for this business, right, being $600,000. Well, fast forward 5 years later, that business was ultimately purchased, but it went from $600,000 in revenue in the December prior to the acquisition to $600,000 in annual revenues. But guess what? It made more profit than it did with the $600,000 in December revenues.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really is about understanding why you want to get where you want to get, and does it make sense to even do it,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, you've got to understand, I hate to use this phraseology, but you've got to understand your why behind it, right? Landon and I had a call earlier today with a prospective client, and he told us that his ultimate, if somebody offered him $50 million for his business today, he'd sell it today, right? And Landon's follow-up question, as it should have been, was, why did you choose that number? Right? Why does that number mean anything to you? And actually, I was surprised that he had a response to that, because most don't.
Mm-hmm.
He just kind of picked this number out of the sky. But he said, well, because after taxes, I'll have $20 million left. And and with 5% per year, I'm making $1 million a year without working. So at least he had thought it through, right? And I didn't expect him to have thought it through, but you've got to ask all those questions to get to what the ultimate question is, which will then lead to the ultimate answer.
Yep.
And I think that it's a powerful thing that gets missed an awful lot in the business community today.
It does. And that sales scenario too is a very common, a lot of business owners say that, well, I want to sell my business. Okay, well, for what? And what does it take you to get to that sale price? And I just had that conversation with another business owner. He had kind of an unsolicited offer for a company that he knew, and it wasn't near enough. And so, in going back and revisited it, and we all came to the conclusion, and he got to it, that I'm better off just running this business, maximizing my profit. And if somebody comes along and strokes a big enough check, that's fine. I'm getting out, but I'm not just going to do this to sell it for a price that's not ultimately going to make me happy. So I think you're 100% right. I'm glad he had it. I'm glad he had it thought out though, because I agree with you. Most of the time, it's the why behind the number is very mysterious.
Yeah, he did have it thought out,
like his logic.
And that's the thing, is a lot of people want to just be able to tell somebody that they sold their business for $10 million or $20 million. Well, that's great, but if you could have made more money by just continuing to run the business and extracting $1.5 million or $2 million a year in profits, then why sell it?
Mm-hmm. Yep, totally agree.
Well, Ryan, as we push up against time here, I don't know, maybe let you decide what you think is most important to share in our remaining, call it, 5 or 6 minutes. Should we talk about any expectations for additional programs now that Joe Biden and his team are taking over? Or do you think it would be more valuable to just talk a little bit more in general about some advice that you're providing to business owners to move forward?
Yeah, I think let's go broad, and I can answer your first question very simply, which is I wouldn't bank on it. There's going to be more money that goes out through the economy, but as far as targeted money to the small business community, I'm not planning on it. We're not seeing a lot of buzz around it. So, again, except for maybe those really hard hit businesses. So that's an easy one. I think in general, then some consideration. So one thing I would say is for businesses out there that are going to get PPP2 and following right along that is treat this money to last. So if you're going to get this loan, and for a lot of companies, we're actively involved in a number of them, I think it's going to be a great opportunity, but it's a bridge to the economy reopening in a more full manner. And that's how I would treat it. That's how I advise business owners to treat it. Don't keep some reserves on hand. Still be a little bit cautious. Use this to really turn this money into revenue dollars. And even if that means not making some decisions to bring everything back to full speed right away, that may be in the best interest of the business, even though that's a tough decision. So number one, kind of treat it like it's your last dollar. I think the other thing, and we touched on this a little bit, is just what is with all this relief. So depending on the customer you serve. So let's say that you're a provider to the restaurant or entertainment space. Understanding what this new legislation does potentially to your customer. Does this allow them to buy more? Understanding what this might do to your competitor. What are the secondary and tertiary effects of this bill? I think that's really, really important. And that's not often a step that we all naturally take, right? We're so focused on being in our own businesses and kind of keeping things running. But I think understanding that, because that's also going to help you understand where you go with your business in certainly 2021 and maybe beyond, are your customers getting healthier where maybe they can buy more? Maybe your customers are in a position where they can pay you a little bit quicker. Maybe you've gotten deferred with some of your customers. Let's again go back to that restaurant example. So taking a deep breath and understanding what does this allow you to do, as well as, obviously the simple answer is I would map out what you're going to do with the money yourself in your own four walls. But outside of that, I think the trickle down effect, the domino effect, to reference something we talked about earlier, is going to be very powerful and very important. So that's something I would definitely say to keep in focus. And then, I hit on it, but I'd say it again, is just take intentional action. I use a lot of analogies. They're very popular in our shop, but know where you are and know where you're going. So it's okay to take a break. Maybe you get your PPP2 money and you just take a break and pause for a second. We're going to let a little bit of dust lie, especially here in Arizona, where, we're still apparently the worst place to be in the world. And maybe you do pause for a moment, take a breath, but do it for a reason. And maybe you do need to go back down the mountain a little bit to go to a lower base camp. That may be fine too. Maybe you're going to scale that mountain, but scale it a little bit more slowly. Just do it intentionally, but take action, because again, like I talked about, the entrepreneur is not going to stop. They're not going to slow down. Most entrepreneurs aren't going to wait for the government to do anything further for them. A lot of them weren't waiting at this point. There were a lot of companies that I'm sure you guys saw it too, that just clawed tooth and nail to get where they wanted to and needed to. So I think take action, be intentional. And the last thing I would say, and this is more to all of us, go support small business. It is still a tough time out there. Go get takeout from a local restaurant. Try to support the people out there. Try to support those fellow entrepreneurs. We owe it to them, because there's a lot of people out there unsung every day that are just grinding to keep their doors open. Go see your dry cleaner, because let me tell you, their business has been suffering. Take care of small business around us. We all owe that.
I couldn't agree with you anymore if I tried. It's funny you mentioned the dry cleaner, because I remember walking into my own dry cleaner and his eyes lit up because I was carrying clothes in instead of just picking clothes up, right? And they really have been hit hard, because nobody's getting dressed up anymore. They're not going to the office. And so they have certainly been hit hard. We don't think about them. We do think about the restaurants. We think about, the airlines, the cruise lines, all those sorts of things. But it is truly the local small business owners that need our support, and we need to get out there and do it. So I think if there's a theme from today's show, it's ask a lot of questions, have good people around you who can help you get to the right answer, that aren't just yes men and women who are telling you what you want to hear, but who are willing to be able to have a conversation with you about what you should be doing to run your business more efficiently going forward. We've learned some lessons throughout this. It wasn't a lesson that I ever wanted or expected to learn myself after 20 years in business, but I do think that it's helped us all and that we will be the better for it. I want to remind our audience how lucky they are to have a guest like Ryan Weissmueller to come on the show and to share this information with them. We're happy and grateful to call Ryan a partner of the show and a real advocate for the show. You're going to hear from him more going forward. You'll also be able to hear from him in the newsletters that we put out. He'll help us with some different articles and so forth. So we really look forward to a closer partnership with you throughout 2021 and beyond as well.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks so much again for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan.
You've been listening to Tycoons of Small Biz, proudly hosted by Austin Peterson and Landon Mance. Austin and Landon are comprehensive financial planning professionals specializing in financial, estate, and succession planning for small business owners. Austin and Landon have offices in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Las Vegas, Nevada, and represent clients in 14 states throughout the country. Join Austin, Landon, and the featured tycoons live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. right here on Business RadioX and your favorite podcast.